Forward and have a seat. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Lisa Loomis from the Valley Reporter, and welcome to the 2010 Candidates Forum. I'd like to thank our hosts at the Big Picture Theater, Claudia and Dot, and everybody else who's making it possible for us to be here tonight. Please turn your cell phones off. I'll say that one more time. Please turn your cell phones off. With us tonight are the two candidates for state rep representing Warren, Waitsfield, and Fayston. Incumbent Adam Greshin, who's an independent from Warren, and his challenger, Mac Rood, who's a Democrat also from Warren. A round of applause for our two candidates. Thank you for caring enough to run. The format tonight involves a few words from each candidate, an opening statement. I have prepared questions, and I have also received a fairly large number of questions emailed in from readers, and I want to hear questions from you in the audience as well. And we have an opportunity for the candidates to ask each other questions. So don't be shy about raising your hand to ask a question. Alex McClay, who will raise her hand so you can find her, has the portable mic and will bring it to you. I'd ask that you please state your name and your hometown before you ask your question. And without further ado, we're going to start alphabetically, and Adam will give us his opening statement. 1 minute.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me start by thanking the people in this room and the people throughout the Mad River Valley for electing me 2 years ago. I can assure you it has been a pleasure every minute of it, and I thank you for that. But I'm running for office, and I ran for office 2 years ago because I am passionate about public policy. I enjoy debating it, I enjoy thinking about it, and I enjoy reaching resolutions. So I'm very passionate about public policy. And also, I ran 2 years ago and run today because I think I bring a professional background that is a good fit for the legislature. When people think of balance in the legislature, they tend to think about Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. I tend to think of balance in terms of background. Working, retired, public sector, private sector, skin in the game. And I think it's a good balance to have someone from a private sector background still working in the legislature. I think it brings something to the table. And finally, I'm running because I think service to the community is a good idea, and I'm very happy to serve.
Thank you. Mac.
I'll take my 60 seconds to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. Mac Rood. I've lived in Warren for 37 years, married to Bobby. Both of our kids were born here, brought up here. I've spent a lot of time with service to my town, 9 years on the school board, 6 years on the select board, a few years on the Mad River Planning District Steering Committee, Warren Education Fund. My background is as an architect. Our firm prefers to work on projects that are either energy related, conservation related, or reinforcement of downtowns. For example, City Market in Burlington, Pitcher Inn in Warren. And I have also done a fair amount of community work, teaching Yestermar School for 30 years, and I see the stop sign, so I'll follow up later.
My first question is about an issue that I'm sure we're going to hear quite a bit about tonight. It's about citing alternative energy projects. My question is, how will you work in Montpelier to change how the Vermont Public Service Board issues certificates of public good for alternative energy projects? Specifically, what level of local participation is appropriate? And secondly, how will you work to bring that about? So you'll start this time, Mac. We'll alternate.
Okay. I think that the Public Service Board does need to take local considerations into account, and we need to reform the way they define public good to make sure that it takes into account town plans. They are directed to pay attention to that now. I don't think that they are doing so. So I think that their mission is to manage utilities, cell service, broadband, gas distribution, electric distribution. I don't think that we want to take that authority away from them and give it to towns. I don't think towns are equipped to do that. But I do think that we need to make sure that we take a second look, a hard look at what is defined as the public good, so that they are using town plans as a criteria when they're making their decisions.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial that the towns have a say in the permitting of large power projects. And I think there's one of two ways we can do it. The first way is by looking at Section 248, which is the statute that the Public Service Board follows, and simply changing the terminology from due consideration to conformance with town plans. I think there needs to be a very strong input from the towns when these projects are permitted. And the due consideration is simply not adequate. So I think we need to look at that and require some type of conformance with town plan. And you know, the second thing we can do, if that is one option, I'd say a second option is to use the precedent that we used with the nuclear plant. And the legislature inserted itself into the process years ago because it thought it was too important not to. Why leave it to the Public Service Board in projects that are that important? So we can do it either legislatively or by requiring conformance with town plan.
A question from the audience. You're all too shy still? All right, I'm not too shy. My next question is about income sensitivity, and there's been some talk about reducing it at the state level in order to reduce the cost of education. And I'm curious about how, in reducing it, you can make that fair for Valley taxpayers. I'm going to cite some 2008 statistics to lay the groundwork for my question. In 2008, the average annual wage in the three towns was $29,393, compared to $38,000 in Vermont and $40,000 in Washington County. The average home price in those three towns was $248,828. It's worth noting that Warren's average annual income was $22,718, and its average home price was the highest in the valley at $340,788. Per pupil spending in those three towns ranges from $12,000 to $13,300 in 2008, and the state average was $12,000 per pupil that year. Given this data, it appears that Valley taxpayers pay more for their homes, earn less than others in Washington County, and are spending fairly close to the state average in per pupil spending. How can you reduce income sensitivity if you would, and how can you do it fairly to the Valley taxpayers? And Adam, this is you.
Do you want to go first on that? You know, I think that's a good question. And I think the answer, first of all, is that we have to take a look at how we manage and how we allocate income sensitivity checks. Keep in mind that the cost of income sensitivity to the state this year will be about $165 million. When the program was initiated, it was about a third of that. So it's grown about 8 to 10% every year. And one way to do it is to put in a step function whereby those people who are at the lower income levels would pay, as they do now, 1.8% of their income. And as their income grew, they would pay a slightly higher percent until they reached a certain level where they would pay the full amount. I would support looking at that, although, you know, the key, as always, is in what percentage payment and at what income level. But I do think we need to think about a step function. I don't think we want to eliminate the program.
Thank you, Adam. Mac, your thoughts?
I think that it would be good to take a look at revising the system so that on a homestead, on a primary home, people paid strictly on the basis of income rather than property value, which would obviously make payments based on the ability to pay rather than property value. We are greatly disadvantaged in the valley by Act 60, as we all know, because of the property value that we have here, which some people may view as a benefit, but is actually a hindrance. It's actually a handicap when you're trying to maintain the diversity of the valley and keep people of modest income or low income here living, working, and maintaining a home.
Thank you. I'm going to hog the floor for one more question, then open it back up to you guys. Staying with the issue of taxes tax policy has been a hot topic during the gubernatorial race, with Lieutenant Governor Brian Doobie proposing significant cuts to the top marginal tax rates applying to the highest income Vermonters. Senator Shumlin opposes this plan. Do you support this proposal? And Adam, you're first.
I think the proposal would have to be looked at from the standpoint of revenue neutrality, first off. If we have a budget deficit, I think we have to be very careful about changing tax policy. Second comment I make is there is a commission, a Blue Ribbon Tax Commission, that is looking at that very question right now. I think in a general sense, I think if we broaden the tax base by attracting more people into the state, we can take less from more people and thus end up with the same, if not more. So I think we have to look seriously about being competitive with other states. But I think we also have to keep in mind that we have budgetary issues here that need to be dealt with. So I look very much forward to what the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission has to say on that.
Thank you, Adam. Mac?
I would not support Brian Doobie's proposal to cut the tax rate, which seems to me would benefit primarily people in high income brackets. I just don't think the trickle-down theory works that well, and we do need the tax revenue.
Thank you. Okay, all you people are frothing to ask questions. Alex is going to come over to Alan Uris, and then you can be next, Dave. Alan, please state your name and your hometown.
My name is Alan Uris, formerly of Warren, now of Waitsfield. At any rate, Adam, you stated that you believe that the private sector should be well represented in the legislature. And as a partner in Sugar Bush and also as a full-time employee, do you have an opinion concerning whether, when you represent the people of the towns in the valley, whether you have in some sense a conflict, and whether the old saying that can a man serve two masters would apply or perhaps wouldn't apply?
I think that's a good question. And you know, the way the legislature was originally set up, and the way many state legislatures are set up, they specifically want people from all walks of life. So the idea of someone having a conflict because he or she works in the private sector or in the public sector, I think is not valid. I think we need people working in the private sector. We need people in the public sector. We need retirees. We need young people. We need old people. And the idea is you want people from different walks of life. I think it's extremely important that people have some skin in the game. And by that I mean that people can represent the areas that they work for.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Alan. Dave Sellers? State your name for the record.
Dave Sellers and live in Warren. This is a question about, for both you guys who've been on school boards. All the towns in the valley are gold towns, as we all know. We send out way more money than we raise in taxes, sometimes a factor of 2 or 3. It seems to me if you did income sensitivity, that extra money would go to the non-residents, like the second home owners or the businesses or so on, to make up that difference. Is there a way, can you think of a way to modify Act 60 to put a cap on the amount of money that these gold towns could legitimately raise? It doesn't make sense to me that most of the employees, at least that I know of, my employees, can't live in the valley. They'll have to live in Northfield or Montpelier or somewhere else because they can't afford to live here. And I think that the fact that we have to send so much money out of state is killing us, especially when we have low income. So I would hope that you guys could figure out some way that whoever gets elected, and we have a strategy to put a cap on the amount of money we gold towns send away.
Thank you, Dave. Mac, that's yours.
I agree with you, Dave, and I think that we should do whatever we can in that regard. I think it's mostly a legal question as to, how much money can we keep and still comply with the Supreme Court decision. But we are in an unfortunate situation where what used to be self-supporting, self-contained towns that, in our case, had low tax rates but high property values, are no longer able to, really maintain themselves as communities. We're now part of a larger community called Vermont. Hopefully we won't have to spread our wealth much farther than the boundaries of the state, but I think that I think we need to push back and figure out how can we cap property taxes in such a way that we can keep more of the tax that we have to raise.
Thank you, Mac. Adam?
Thanks for the question. I made precisely that suggestion. And my suggestion was to set a level, an actual hard cap, 50%, 60% of a town's total revenue that would be transferred to Montpelier net of what it raised. That ran into problems that ran into legal problems, and it was more the implication they didn't want to take the legal chance. But my suggestion would be to take the legal chance, because the state's interpretation of the Brigham decision is just that, an interpretation that can be challenged. The second idea that I had, and I think actually may well take legs, is to go back to what we had in the old days. Actually, there were many systems in the old days, but one of them was for the state to guarantee every town a minimum level of school spending. And if that town wanted to spend more than that, the town would raise it on its own. I think that too has legs, because it connects the tax consequences of local school spending with the budget.
Thank you. I'm going to carry on with a question about Brigham that came in from a reader in Fayston. And the question is whether or not Act 60 and 68 are repealed in 2011. Would you vote for funds to review the Brigham decision and have consultants look at how school funding is handled in all other 49 states to find more fairness and some property tax relief? And what do you know of school funding systems in other states? And that is Adam first.
We are funding a commission to look into school funding, as well as every other tax policy that we have. As I mentioned before, the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission is looking into just that. There are 3 commissioners, Bill Schubart, Bill Sayer, and Kathy Hoyt, and they are, as part of their mission is to look into education funding. I don't know an awful lot about how other states fund their education. I'm somewhat familiar with Massachusetts, my former home, and they do it based on somewhat of a modified foundation formula. But I'm not as familiar with how other states do it. I think it is extremely important to look at how else it's done.
I think we should take a look at other strategies for funding education. I think we should look at the Brigham decision to see in what ways it can be challenged. I am not familiar with how other states fund their education, but we should definitely be pushing the envelope.
Thank you. From the audience, Art Trezise, please wait till Alex brings you the microphone.
I spoke with Ann Cummings last week, and she said that there is going to be an expert study of the schooling situation by Mr. Tsao in January. Is that true? Have you heard about that? But I asked her about education, and she said education as well.
I think she misheard.
Yeah. In any event, I think that the educational situation is far more complex than most people recognize, and we fall into old cliches such as local control and such, but it doesn't address the real point, which is it's grossly inefficient for the number of students we have. Our rate per student is terribly high. And I think, Adam, with your experience in the private sector, and as well, Mac, it could be possible to find a better way of organizing the structure of the education in our town. And one of the principal authors on this subject said that one of the better solutions would be to have a board of districts in the neighborhood, possibly 5, perhaps 6 or 7, made up mostly of teachers and parents. That would be a counseling organization, and to have the principal act more as a CEO of the individual schools with the right to hire and fire teachers. Even that's directly in contrast with tenure, as you know. But in any event, it's far easier to administer, and it's the way most of us have worked all our lives. We have to do a good job or we're out. And in that way, we would be able to avoid this morass of trying to get meritocracy of extra pay for extra students. How would you feel about a study by an outside expert to try to redesign the system?
Thank you, Art. Mac, that's yours.
Studies are good. I think it would be, I think we need to look at ways to control education spending. Obviously, it's a big problem. The number of students is dropping across the state, including in our towns, and the cost keeps going up. We do need to get the cost under control. It needs to be commensurate with inflation, basically, and no more. So I don't think that we want to lose local control. I object to the way the state is inserting themselves into the funding, the way we're allocating money in schools. The study that you're mentioning sounds intriguing. Haven't heard of that proposal before. The proposal that's usually floated is consolidation, which we of course look at periodically. The last time we looked at it, at least in Warren, there wasn't that much savings to be had from consolidation, but I think that we need to keep looking.
Thank you, Mac. Adam.
Yeah, if I had $1 for every study that we've done on education, I could fund my campaign, actually. We've done an enormous amount of studies, and most meetings on education at the state level start with data dissemination. And you chew on the data for 2 or 3 meetings, and it tells you what you already know or you should know. So I think there's been a lot of studies done. I think it's the courage to make changes that we need to take on. And I think we need to make administrative changes from the top by looking at how many supervisory unions we have and what the functions of the supervisory unions are. And I think we need to make changes at the local level. So you can start at the top by looking at a number of supervisory unions, and then you could filter down to the local level and see if there's sharing between educators, sharing between resources, and ultimately whether you can achieve what you want to achieve with less.
Thank you. Another audience question? Jim Layton? Then you, Stellan.
I'm Jim Layton, and I live in beautiful Waitsfield. No matter how much you try to control school costs and educational costs, they're still going to be there, and they still have to be funded. And for several years, I've wondered why we emphasize in this state funding of education by means of the property tax instead of fairer taxes like the income tax. What's your views on that?
Adam, you're first.
One reason, or the reason why we fund education with the property tax, historically has been the property tax is stable and rising, and it's thought to be a good measure of wealth. If we fund education with the income tax, we have to be careful. Income is a notoriously bad reflection of wealth. I say that because income can be managed. It is highly variable. For example, if you look at the current economic situation, income has fluctuated far more than properties. That may change, but historically, income has been no better at measuring capacity to pay than property. So I think we need to be careful. I would also say that the total amount of income tax collected in Vermont is about $550 million. The total amount of homestead property tax that went into education, homestead, not business, not non-homestead, but homestead property tax that went into education, net of refunds is about $370 million. So that would be an awful lot of income we'd have to come up with.
Thank you. Mac?
As I said earlier, I think we should look at income tax for homesteads. It is variable, but we fund a lot of other things with the income tax, and it seems to work pretty well. I just think it is, while every system is imperfect and no system is going to totally accurately reflect somebody's ability to pay, I think income tax is much more reliable in terms of ability to pay, and not advocating that we eliminate property tax entirely. I think we still need to do it for non-residential properties, but in terms of our total tax burden, there's, I think, an inordinate amount that's being placed on the property tax currently, and that's what probably the biggest complaint I've heard in the door-to-door that I've been doing. It's the number one issue in people's mind is property tax.
Thank you. Stellan?
Yeah, I don't, do I need to like?
Yes.
It's the law.
Okay. Every election season, and since Act 60 was
Wait,
passed.
I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself to those
I'm
who
sorry.
don't know
Stellan Walmar from Fayston. I'm saying every election season since Act 60 was passed, I have queried candidates from Ann Cummings, who always used to tell me, oh, she was against it, to, the most right-wing politician in the state. Every year I get people telling me, oh yes, that's my priority, is to see the statewide property tax overturned and a new system put in place. And I'm asking the two of you, what, in terms of your agenda, what is the priority you give to introducing a bill to overturn the statewide property tax and put something else that is fair and makes sense in its place?
Thank you, Stellan. Mac, the ball's in your court.
We clearly, in the Valley, are in a minority in terms of our interests versus the rest of the state. So while it's a priority for me, I'd be kidding you if I said it wasn't difficult to do. So in order to, you can introduce a bill, but you have to have enough people to pass it. So we have to come up with a coalition of people who will agree on a solution. We have to come up with a solution, an alternative solution that enough people will buy into so that we can make the change.
Is it a priority for you?
It's a priority.
Adam?
Everyone loves to hate the property tax. If you ask 150 representatives, easily 100 of them or more will say, oh, I hate the tax. We got to do something else. Yet the last education bill that passed 95-41. I was not one of the 95. And that bill made little fixes to Act 68 and encouraged us to do more with school consolidation and changed nothing in the way we finance education and provided no incentives for good schools. It was strictly a quick fix to Act 68. So it's going to be very difficult, but is it a priority? Absolutely. And that will go through my committee. So I can assure you that will receive a lot of attention.
Thank you. I can't see who you are, but I can see you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Alex. Wynn Smith, resident of Warren. I'm confused by both answers. And Mac, looking at the income tax, if we look at Warren and most gold towns, most of the tax revenue in Warren actually comes from non-residents, from second homeowners who are not residents of Vermont. So if we were to go to an income tax away from property tax, how would we actually make that deficit up? Because the last thing I saw, you can't really tax non-residents constitutionally.
Actually, it's Adam's turn to answer first, but Mac, you can go ahead.
Well, just to clarify the point, the answers were confusing to me.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I don't see any alternative to a non-resident and business property tax, simply because they don't pay income tax here. Or actually, the fact is there's about 45,000 tax returns we receive from non-residents, but they tend to be small amounts that reflect some business they do in Vermont, but it wouldn't be a significant amount. So there really is no alternative to a statewide property tax for non-residents and businesses. But I think there are alternatives to the property tax for residents, and I think that's where we have to concentrate. Keep in mind that non-residents and businesses pay about 45% of the total education fund. Homesteaders, homeowners, pay about 28%. So non-residents and businesses pay a big chunk. By statute, I believe they have to pay 35%. But that level has crept up year after year as income sensitivity payments have increased, which has reduced the amount of homestead tax payments.
think our priority has to be in tax relief for Vermonters, people who are living here and trying to make a living. There is no alternative to a property tax for non-residential and commercial properties. I'm not aware when of the prohibition on, or why you say there's a prohibition on changing the tax system for primary residences. That's what I think we should do.
Thank you, Mac. I'm going to go to a reader question that came in, and it's long. Since when we vote for a state representative, we are really hiring someone to do a job for us that involves listening to testimony and debate, introducing legislation, and helping form it in a way that represents our values. Please articulate your core values relating to government so we can choose the candidate who most closely matches ours. And that is Mac.
Well, I think the most important qualification that you should have for the person you select as a legislator is clear convictions and good judgment. None of us are going to be expert in everything that we have to address or debate or deal with. So my core convictions, the things that I've run on in this campaign, are to fix our healthcare system. I think that we do need to go to a single-payer system, integrated, much cheaper than the system that we've got now, which is increasing at the rate of $500 million a year. And I think that we also need to address climate change. We need to do everything we can to wean ourselves from fossil fuels and get onto renewable forms of energy. And I think we need to close down Vermont Yankee.
Thank you. And let's hold our applause till the end. We can give a big rousing round of applause. Adam.
You know, some famous politician years ago said, don't ask the government to help solve the problem. The government is the problem. And I think if you believe that, you shouldn't be serving in government. I think government has a role to play. I think government has as many problems as any other organization, but I think it has a role to play. So what do I see government? I think government should be compassionate. I think it should be there to help people, to provide advice and to provide help when people need the help and can't help themselves. And I also think it should be efficient. I think it should reflect the underlying values of the people who fund it. So I think both efficiency and compassion are the mark of a good government.
Thank you, Adam. Before we go on, there are a few seats down here for those of you who don't want to stand. Down here in the cheap seats. Okay, just so you know, you don't have to stand. I'm going to follow up with a reader question that you've all been waiting for. Do you support the suggested project to install some 15 or 24 500-foot tall wind turbines on the Northfield Ridge between Northfield and the Valley towns? And what is your reasoning? And it's Adam's turn. McAdam. It's McAdam's turn. He's a Scotsman.
You know, we spoke earlier about the regulatory process, the legislative process that would, and I think that is more important. My personal opinion is I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's economically viable, and I don't think it's environmentally sensible. But my opinion should be no more important than anyone else's opinion because I'm one vote in a town. And I think legislatively we have to work to make sure that the towns, not just Waitsfield or Warren or Facein, but all the towns that will be affected have a vote. And I think that's very important. So personally, no, I don't think it's a particularly good idea. But importantly, I think everyone should have an opportunity to weigh in on that by providing conformance to town plan and giving the towns a voice.
Mac, your thoughts?
I'm a big supporter of wind power, but I'm not sure that that's the appropriate site for development. We don't have the information on it yet. The testing hasn't been done up there. Personally, I think that there probably is not enough wind to have a viable project on that ridge. If there were, then we need to look at the environmental impacts, and we need to have it be in conformance with the town plan of Waitsfield, which I don't believe it is currently unless the plan has changed. The conversation is a great one. It's really good that the Valley is talking about energy and where we're going to get it, because that is really the conversation we want to have. I think we want to produce our energy as locally as possible, and we should be doing more than token energy production. We use 250 million BTUs per capita in this state for transportation, commercial, industrial, and residential. That's the kind of number that we should be looking at and figuring out how we're going to produce.
I'm just going to follow up on that with my own question. Adam, you mentioned everyone should have a say in it. Each town should have a say, whether it's Northfield, Roxbury, Moortown, Warren, and Waitsfield. Do you feel that the issue should be voted on a town-by-town basis? And I'm asking both of you this question, town-by-town, person-by-person. So, for example, should it be a referendum at town meeting, and should it be a binding vote, as it was in Lowell, and was then taken by Green Mountain Power to the Public Service Board and used to gain the certificate of public good for that project? So I think it's Mac's turn to answer that.
I think that we need to be really careful about how we change the process by which we regulate utilities. It's tempting to say that we should give this power entirely to the towns and we should have town votes, but make sure I think we need to consider whether or not it's appropriate to have 251 towns regulating things like cell service, broadband, electric distribution, gas distribution. Most states, possibly all states, have public utility commissions. The purpose of them is to be able to devise strategies for disseminating these services in an orderly way to the whole state. So I think we definitely need to reform the process so that the public good that is considered by the PSB takes the town wishes into account. Whether or not towns should be able to completely veto utility decisions taken at the state level, I'm not sure of yet.
Thank you, Mac. Adam, your thoughts?
You know, we have a process already in statute that we use for many building projects, Act 250, that doesn't require every single town and every single member of every single town to have a voice, but it does allow a voice. And it's true that other states regulate differently, or it's true that we regulate like every other state does, but it's also true that Vermont is the only state that decided about 10 years ago that nuclear power was too important to leave in the hands of the Public Service Board. I would argue that large power projects, industrial projects that can dramatically change the character of our state deserve more input than 3 people on a Public Service Board. So I think there has been precedent in the past, and I would use that again.
Thank you. Audience members? I can't see who you are, but I see the hand. Please state your name. The lights are funny up here.
Jim Boylan from Waitsfield. There's a question, you've been talking about spending money, so this is like a question about making money for the state. I mean, here we are in the Valley, you know, a few years ago we lost Mad River Canoe. Ben and Jerry's could arguably not be considered a Vermont company anymore. Carl Schuss went to Austria, which is hardly a low-wage country. And now there's, you know, Nestle's making noises about coffee roasters. We have 2 gubernatorial candidates talking about creating jobs. I mean, realistically, what would your approach be to economic development in Vermont?
Thank you, Jim. Mac, that's yours. Oh, sorry, that's Adam. That's yours question. Mac, Adam.
You know, many people have said, or some people have said, and I agree with it, governments don't create jobs. What governments do is they create the climate for entrepreneurs to create jobs. And I think what we need to do in this state is, first of all, recognize that we do have an issue with economic growth and job creation. Are we any worse than other states? Hard to say. but I think we can make improvements in that area, and I personally do think that there are other states that do a better job of it. So you create a climate that encourages businesses to set up here, and that has to be, one, an environment that allows entrepreneurs to take risks and reap the rewards of their risks, and that's a tax climate that allows entrepreneurs to do their thing, and to make a tax climate that is competitive. Doesn't have to be super competitive, but at least we should be competitive with other states. And the second thing is you need a regulatory environment that is swift and fair and transparent. And I would accent swift to give businesses visibility and transparency. So I think that's very important.
Thank you, Adam. Mac?
Government doesn't create jobs. They do create the climate for job creation. I think we need to look at what are some of the reasons why businesses move out of state or move out of the valley. I think part of it is infrastructure. I think that we need to do all we can to get broadband to the whole state. It's really vital for small businesses especially. I think we need to obviously keep our road network up, although next year is not going to be a good year to do that. The regulatory environment, I've done in my profession many Act 250 applications and 4 Act 248 applications. There is a way to make them more consumer friendly without diminishing their effectiveness in terms of regulating the environment and things that we want to regulate. So I'd definitely be in favor of making it more consumer friendly.
Thank you, Mac. Anyone out there dying to ask a question? Did I see your hand go up, Laura? Alex will bring you the mic.
Laura Caffrey, I live in Waitsfield. People talk about creating new jobs and attracting new businesses. In the last session, some work was done that affects things within the Department of Labor as far as unemployment insurance and workers' compensation. And it's still very complicated, and what makes an employee is different for compensation, workers' compensation, as compared to unemployment. What can we do to make the business climate more simple, more transparent for the businesses that are already here?
Thank you, Laura. Mac?
I think that what we need to do is take a look at how the definitions are handled by different departments, different tax departments, and try to get them in conformance with each other. Needless complication is definitely a hindrance to doing business in a smooth and efficient way. So, I mean, your question is almost a statement of what we need to do, which is to make sure that it's understandable and fair for all businesses and employees.
Thanks, Mac. Adam?
Last year I was heavily involved in the debate and ultimately the fixing of our unemployment insurance trust fund, which is a classic example of bad policy 30 years ago that came home to roost last year during the recession. And I'm intimately aware of the errors we made then. And the fix that we provided was difficult. Employees had to take their share of pain. Employers had to take their share of pain. And my role in there, and a few of my colleagues, was to make sure there was balance there. With workers' compensation, we spent about 4 of the 5 months and 2 months prior to the session working out a workers' compensation bill that did everything they could to close out fraud, which is important, but did absolutely nothing to reduce the cost of workers' compensation for Vermont businesses. And I can tell you, as someone who pays a significant amount of workers' comp, that Vermont, relative to other states, has a lot of work to do. And that's something that we absolutely need to do.
Thank you. Stellan? Wait for the mic. Wait for it.
Stellan Wilmer again. Both you gentlemen say that governments do not create jobs, that they create the climate for same. First of all, don't tell that to the federal government. Secondly, if you take an example such as Singapore, which when it became independent after the Second World War, created an incredible strategy for itself that decided what industries would be built in that country, then set up the training in their school systems, and finally began to invite investors to come into Singapore to fulfill those strategies. It has been immensely successful, and I find that the state of Vermont has done nothing of the equivalent, and in fact doesn't even have a hotline for people who are investors out of state to call and get a one-stop view of what Vermont needs, for example, in terms of import replacement. You know, what are the projects that Vermont has decided that it wants? And how are you going to get investors to come in and do it?
Adam?
You know, on the government on the idea that government doesn't create jobs, let me say this. Government can create policies that create jobs. And I'll give you a perfect example of that, Stelling. Just this morning, Senator Leahy was in town, and we took him for a lap around the 2 new buildings at Sugarbush. That is a program that was created by the government to attract foreign investors. That is a terrific program, and it is responsible for those 2 buildings going up. That's employed over 200 people, will create many full-time jobs and permanent jobs. So that's a program that, you know, in Senator Leahy's terms, if we're exporting jobs overseas, why not import jobs from overseas here? That attracts foreign investors into this country. That program was created years ago, and it wallowed until a couple of people, notably the senior senator from Vermont and a few others, picked it up and decided to push it. So there are things, programs that governments can do that help create work. And I think we can do more of those.
Thank you, Adam. Mac?
I don't think we have the authoritarian kind of government that Singapore has, so I'm not sure.
Have you been there and seen what they've done?
I have not been there, but I know they've done a great job. But I also understand that they're not quite the same kind of democratic country that we have here. I don't think that we want to run our country like Singapore, and I don't think people would necessarily want us to. But you know, there are things that the government can do. The federal government is creating jobs through the stimulus program, which has been successful, although much maligned. It has, I think, prevented us from descending into a depression. And I think that the state government, to a much lesser extent, can create jobs by putting people to work on projects. I think that, you know, we need to do everything we possibly can.
Thank you, Mac. I see a hand, but I can't see your faces because it's too bright here. That's Todd. Now I see. Please identify yourself.
Todd Scheinfeld from Waitsfield. Along that same lines of government helping to frame and create the environment in which businesses can come to Vermont or thrive in Vermont, I'm going to ask you a 2-part question each. What do you see as the major impediment of government as you see it today, and what would you like to do about it? And then subsequently, what do you see as the greatest opportunity for Vermont, and how would you like to capitalize on it?
Thank you, Todd. Good questions. It is Mac's turn.
I think that we have done a terrible job over the last 8 years in terms of promoting Vermont. I think that we've created a myth that we are a business-unfriendly state. I've done business in Vermont for 35 years, and while there are things that I could imagine being done better, I don't think it's wise for us to be broadcasting to the world that Vermont is a bad place to do business. I think that what we should be promoting is what we all know we have. It's a great place to live. It's a great place to work. We have more patents, I think, per capita developed here than anywhere in the country. There's a lot of innovation. We have a lot of value-added products with the various things that we produce, the agricultural things that we produce. So I think we've got great assets, and we need to promote them.
Thank you, Mac. Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I too think it's probably counterproductive to tour around saying Vermont's bad for business. But I do think it is important to recognize that we can make improvements, and that we can make improvements to create work for people and to bring people in. It's also true that Vermont's population is not growing, and work is not being created here enough to support the quality of life and the standard of living that young people would like when they move here. So I think we need to recognize that. And what can Vermont do? I think we need to promote our strengths. We're a beautiful place to live. I think we need to promote tourism. I think we also need to promote service jobs, because I think we can carry those out. So I think we need to base what we do on the strengths that we already have and build on them.
Thank you. I'm going to interject with a reader question. The House this year passed legislation in April by a vote of 91 to 42 that requires the creation of a Vermont healthcare system design options. It expands the Blueprint for Health program, limits hospital budget increases, requires the reporting of free prescription sample giveaways, and enacts other amendments to healthcare laws. What are your thoughts on that legislation? Adam, that starts with you.
I think you're referring to the last healthcare bill that we passed?
Yes, the April one, yes.
Right. I think that legislation had a lot of good things to it. I think the most important part of the legislation was the study that was required to be carried out, that will be presented to the legislature on February 1, I believe. I also think that there was a few things that we could have done without in that legislation. I think it further restricted, it further provided mandates to hospitals, which I think can be carried out when we have a new healthcare system, that I found somewhat troublesome. But I think, most importantly, the early part of that legislation, which commissioned a study a healthcare system and an organization for the state of Vermont, is very important, and I look forward to that study going, for the next legislative session.
Thank you. Mac?
I agree with Adam that the most important part of that legislation was the study that was commissioned that is going to present us with three different options: a study of a single payer system, a study of a public option system, and a study of a tweaking, presumably, of the system that we have. I believe that, Adam, you voted against that bill. I'm glad that it passed, but I think it's going to be really important, and looking forward to moving forward with the, presumably the recommended option, which I imagine is going to be the single payer, but I will keep my mind open. If something else comes out of that study, I will certainly listen to it.
Thank you, Mac. Of course. Wait for the microphone. That's the law.
Yeah, I'm Randy Tamplin. I'd like to ask you both how you do feel about single-payer system.
So that's starting with Mac.
I think single-payer system is definitely the way to go. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. Every other industrialized country has some version of a publicly financed system that works well at approximately half the cost. We have a very fragmented system for delivering healthcare. The quality of the healthcare itself is good, but the method of delivery and paying for it is what's broken. As I just said, I'm going to keep my mind open when this study comes back by Dr. Xiao, but as it stands right now, I can't believe that anything is going to make as much sense as single-payer healthcare system.
Thank you, Mac. Your thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, it seems that many people have already made up their minds before they see the study. I think it's a wise idea to see the study. I think the important thing about healthcare is the following: that any program that we adopt has to have a simplified payment system and single payer is enticing in that regard. But it also has to be de-linked from employment. I think we have to get beyond the idea that you need a job and companies have to pay for health care. Our premiums for my company went up 34% this year. I don't see any company that can absorb that kind of payment pressure. So it has to be de-linked from employment. It has to be preventative. I mean, come on, we need to be preventing people from getting sick before they get sick. It's much easier to deal with them early on. And it has to have, importantly, it has to have a price tag. Single payer, maybe great. What's it going to cost? What am I going to ask you guys, and what am I going to ask the employers to pay for it? So let's see the cost numbers and see what maybe it's great, but let's see it before we can decide. And finally, it has to have a cost control mechanism. How are we going to control the costs? That's the big problem we have.
Thank you, Adam. I can't see your face, but I see your hand. Alex will see you.
Hi, my name is Carol Crossman. I'm from Warren. And I know I'm going back a little bit to the health education, the education system, but I think the biggest cost factor in education is health care, paying for the benefits of all the employees, state employees, school employees, whatever. This is an enormous cost, and it goes up every year, and it's not going to stop until we address this issue of health care. Single-payer system is the most efficient way to go. I was just wondering, Adam, to you, my question is, if you had a single-payer system at, say, Sugar Bush, where you have seasonal workers, I don't know how many employees you pay for their health care, but if you had a single-payer system, would that be more cost-efficient to your private sector business, you know?
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to actually let both of them answer that question because Mac has been an employer as well. And it is Adam's turn to start.
If we have a single-payer system, it would certainly make our jobs as employers easier. There is no question. But as to the second part of your question, would it be more efficient? I think you also mentioned the cost. I can't answer that. You know, years ago there was a study on what they thought the cost would be. I think maybe it was the Hogan Commission. They looked at the cost, and they thought it would be some type of payroll tax of about 13.5%. 3.4%, I think they said, would be paid by employees and 10.1% by the company. We could run the numbers on that and see, but I would want to take a very hard look at that to see whether it's cost efficient for us. It would certainly make our jobs easier because we wouldn't have to take care of health care for our employees.
Thank you, Adam. Mac, your thoughts?
The value of single payer, one of the values is that it is not based on employers. It goes with the individual. It'll take away a lot of the burden. It'll take away the entire burden on employers, and it will take away a lot of worry on the part of the individual because they won't have to worry about losing their insurance as they go from job to job or lose their job. You know, to the point of cost control, I just read Deb Richter and Con Hogan's latest book on health care, and the thing that they really emphasize is that we need to have a health care budget, and that the only way to really do that is to have a comprehensive integrated system, and that will allow us to get cost controls on the system, which we are not able to institute right now. And finally, in terms of prevention, I completely agree that that's where we need to go. We need to, and a single-payer system will help us do that as well.
Thank you, Mac. I'm going to interject a question here. Given the Senate vote last session, on Vermont Yankee and the increasingly bad news about leaks at that Vernon plant, is Vermont Yankee a dead issue, or does that plant have legs? And that is to you, Mac. Starts with you.
I have thought for a long time that Vermont Yankee should not be relicensed when their license expires in 2012. And my opinion is only reinforced by every development that seems to come out of that company. I hope it doesn't have legs. I mean, I hope that the matter has been settled, but It's important to be vigilant on it and make sure that it doesn't come back again. I would have, in the last session, voted to set up a decommissioning fund to reinforce the decommissioning fund, which I think is an important aspect to this, to the matter, and I know that Adam voted against it. I'd be interested in hearing why he voted against it.
Okay, you got 2 questions for the price of 1. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is a dead issue. The Senate voted 26-4 against recommissioning the plan. The only way that vote will change is if enough senators change hands or enough seats in the Senate change hands to bring that vote up again. I would say that is highly unlikely, and it makes it a moot point for the House. So I think the issue will be how we will replace that energy, not whether we will be using the energy from Vermont Yankee going forward.
Thank you. I had asked the candidates to prepare questions to ask each other, so I'm going to take a few minutes and hear one of their questions for each other, and then we'll come back to your questions. It's nice to see so many questions. So, Adam, you can start with a question for Mac.
Actually, can I just use the question he asked me first?
Sure, if you'll restate it for everybody who was thinking about something else.
Want to restate?
Actually, that was going to be my first question.
Okay, so Mac, you go first. All right, so fine.
To explain why you voted against the decommissioning fund in the last session.
There is a nuclear decommissioning process that was negotiated in 2002 when the plant changed hands. The bill that I think Mac is referring to would have dramatically accelerated payments to the decommissioning fund by $100 million, I think, in each of the next 3 or 4 years. And my reasoning on that was, one, it violates the terms of the Certificate of Public Good in 2002, which is simple enough. But more importantly, I emphasized when I wrote about it that it would set up an extremely long and costly court battle that we'd still be fighting now, so we'd be investing in lawyers instead of investing in decommissioning. And 3, it sets an alarming precedent for going back on agreements that were made with our eyes wide open and everyone at the table. So I think we have to be careful on that. And that's why I voted against it. It had nothing to do with my love for the plan.
Thank you. Okay, Adam, it's your turn.
I would like to ask, you've mentioned a couple of times that you think that income, looking at school financing, you think that the income tax is a better way to do it. And I'm curious at how you would suggest we structure it so that we come up with the necessary funds, keeping in mind that the non-residents wouldn't be paying anything, and it would be strictly residents, and that 2/3 of the people, or about 70% of the people, already pay based on income. So how would we arrive at numbers that would fully fund schools using strictly an income tax?
Well, I'm not proposing that we eliminate the property tax for non-residential properties. I'm only proposing it for residential homestead properties. I think that the tax would be, we need to replace the money that we're eliminating from the property tax with the income tax, so that's how you would set the rate. I understand and agree that there is a complicated system in place for taking income sensitivity into account. I think that the system that we have now is so complicated that it puts school boards in a bad situation. It puts them under the gun from voters who don't understand how and why their money is being spent. I think that, frankly, many voters don't take advantage of the income sensitivity provisions and perhaps even forget that they're there when the tax rate is set. So I'm in favor of among other things, going to the income tax just for a simplification and to make sure that people understand how and why their taxes are being spent.
Thank you, Mac. I'm going to go with another question for these guys because it's going to give you all fodder for the next thing you want to ask them. So, Mac, it's now you for Adam.
A question for
Another
Adam.
question.
Okay, a question I have for you, Adam, is why, I understand that you aren't part of either the Democratic or the Republican caucus, and so you don't vote, you attend some of those meetings, but you don't vote in either of those caucuses. And how is that advantageous for the Valley to have a representative who doesn't have a vote at the table when policy is being made and decisions are being made as to what legislation is going to be brought to the floor?
The caucus system that we have in the State House is as close to irrelevant as you could imagine. The public, anyone can go to any caucus that you choose. And I was told when I got to the State House that, once those doors close, you're on the outside. But, I would say that it didn't seem to hurt the Valley at all, not having me a member of the caucus. And I say that because the second year I was there, the speaker came to me and said, Adam, I'd like you to serve on the Ways and Means Committee. And I said, I'd be happy to do that. Can I ask why? And he said, because we need someone with your background on that committee. There hasn't been a freshman assigned to the Ways and Means Committee since Gay Symington. And before her, she was it. So I don't think that hurt me too much. The caucus system is way overrated. In politics, it's advocacy and ideas that count. And I think that's extremely important to note.
Thank you. And Adam, one more question for you, from you to Mac.
I actually hadn't prepared another question.
You want to make
Give me
one
some
up?
time.
Okay, we'll come back. We'll hold that thought. An audience question. Is that Eric?
I was listening to
State your name, please.
Eric
in your hometown.
Bradstrom,
Thank you.
Warren. I was listening to Peter Schunlund yesterday saying that if it came up on closing Vermont Yankee, he would be against it. And I understood also that would be for closing it, but that Doobie would be against closing it. Whether that's true or not, to overcome a veto by wanting to keep Vermont Yankee open, how would each of you vote in that case?
So this goes to Adam.
Yeah, I would not vote to, let's see, so it would be Doobie providing the veto? Yeah, I would not vote to override. I think we need to move on. But it's not clear to me that the governor has a role in this debate. I think it's strictly the legislature. So that situation may not come up. But if it did, I'd be happy to go along and vote to close the plant.
Thank you. Mac?
I would vote to close the plant, which if Doobie were governor and there was a veto to be overridden, I would vote to do that.
Thank you. Audience. Hey, Beth. Wait till Alex brings you the mic, please. State your name and your hometown.
Beth Bin Sholkoff from Warren. Green jobs is a priority for the state, as well as an opportunity with the closing of Vermont Yankee. I think the Mad River Valley has demonstrated leadership in the green jobs area for the last 20 to 30 years. And I don't see us mentioned nearly enough in Montpelier when we really put ourselves out there as a leadership community to create green jobs with a lot of the intellectual capital that we have here. We actually have buildings that aren't being used. We really should be it. as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to know what you both would do to try to show leadership on the topic of green jobs in the state of Vermont.
Thank you, Beth. That's yours, Mac.
I don't know why the Mad River Valley doesn't get the full credit. It's the most important community in the whole state, so, you know. But yes, we need to promote green jobs, for sure. I think that we need to, in terms of promoting renewable energy in general, that we need to make sure that incentives are predictable and reliable. Recently, we've run into problems with the incentive program for solar panels and other renewables that have been put in place, where people were guaranteed that they would get a tax credit for projects that were built, and then after they were built, the tax credit was, reneged upon. I think that kind of uncertainty really dampens development of green projects, and we need to work on stabilizing that.
Thank you.
First of all, just a little quibble. I actually sat at two separate meetings over just last year with residents of the Mad River Valley who came to speak about businesses that they operated. Bill Parker visited the State House in March, and Don Mayer has been there any number of times, and I'm sure I missed a number of people who have come from the Valley to testify on the work they've done. So I do think that people who live here have been heard from, and I certainly think that I would be willing, among others, to advocate for business leaders here in the Valley that want to create work. I do think we can do better to boost the creation of green jobs. I think we have to realize, though, that we and probably 35 other states are looking for the same jobs, so we need to create, again, a business climate that encourages job creation. And we need to focus on where we do the best. And I think we do have an expertise in alternative energy, and I think through policies that encourage from a tax standpoint and an incentive standpoint would work very well.
Thank you, Adam. Audience question? Anyone who, I see Todd and I see Eric. Go ahead, Todd, then Eric.
Todd again, I'm still from Waitsfield. We talked a little bit about healthcare, and Mac, I understand your big focus is single payer. I'm really coming from a background in healthcare and the whole financing mechanisms and actuarials and certificates and riders and all that. What do you guys see as the big drivers of healthcare costs? Is it utilization? Is it tort? Is it the fact that we have mental health parity in Vermont, which is unlike any other state? We have some things that contribute to cost, and when I hear about healthcare and single payer and healthcare is a human right and all this, I never hear anybody talk about the drivers. What are the costs? What are the things that drive that cost? And I'd like to know kind of where you think that is.
Thank you, Todd. It's your turn, Adam, though.
One of the reasons people focus on single payer so much is because the belief that the drivers of healthcare costs are administrative, are paperwork, are a convoluted payment system. And I think the reality is that is one cost, but that is not the main driver. The main driver, in a nutshell, is we use too much healthcare. We go to too many procedures. We take too many medicines that don't work. We have too many second opinions. We have too many x-rays and too many MRIs and too many physicians. So, the drivers are utilization. And most importantly, that doesn't mean we shouldn't seek health care. What it means is we need to seek appropriate health care and use data-driven analysis to determine what's good and what's not. So if you want to look at cost drivers, sure, payment system, absolutely, but that's not the main driver. The main driver is the utilization of our health system, and I would say the overutilization of the health system. So any system that we create nationally and in this state, has to look at that problem first, or else it's not going to succeed.
Thank you, Adam. Art, we're going to let Mac answer that as well.
I think that part of the driver for excess cost is duplication and fragmentation, the patchwork of private, federal, and state medical programs that we have. So I think that by going to a single-payer system, we have an opportunity to streamline that duplication and that inefficiency. Another thing that, but clearly utilization is an issue. I think that once again, if we go to a single-payer system, we will have in place a mechanism for creating a budget and being able to start to make decisions about what are appropriate procedures or not, and where we want to go. It's up to us to determine how much we want to spend. I don't think we can spend $500 million a year more every year. That's $1 million, over $1 million a day.
Thank you, Mac. Art, is yours a direct follow-up on Todd's question, or is it a new topic? So, Eric, if you can just hold that thought, and then I'll come right back to you after Art. Go ahead, Art.
Art Trezise Fayston, but I'd like to hear what Adam and Mac would say about the other chunk of cost, which would be the profit and the overhead expense of the insurance companies, which would be eliminated in a single-payer program.
Thank you, Mac. That's to you.
I agree. If we go to a single-payer system, we will be cutting the insurance companies out of this process. Insurance companies are in business to make money, and the way they make the most money is by denying care. So I would encourage insurance companies to look for other forms of insurance to sell and not use them in the health payer system.
Thank you, Mac. Adam.
I don't think there's any question that if you cut out the profit margin for an insurance company, you save money. But the question is, how much do you save? All those workers aren't going to disappear because someone has to administer the new program. So if you cut out a profit margin, for sure, you'll save money. But again, the question is, what are you saving in addition to that? And that doesn't overcome the need to figure out how you can save the lion's share of the cost in the healthcare system, which is utilization, which is inappropriate procedures, which is drugs that don't work. So I think we need to concentrate on the bigger picture.
Thank you, Adam. Okay. Eric, and then Jim Layton, and then we'll go back to you, Laura.
Both of you are developers. In one way or another. What are you guys doing to offset your electric usage? And because a lot of people in this valley are doing whatever they can to offset their power usage one way or the other with good insulation, solar panels, and other means. What are each of you doing on your development projects?
Okay, that starts with you, Adam.
Power is probably the second largest cost that we have after payroll. And a lot of the power, most of the power that we use is in making snow. So the best way we can save on our electric bills and the best way we can save power and be smart about the usage of power is to make snow more efficiently. And in that regard, we have replaced, I don't have exact number, but I would say half or more of the snowmaking nozzles to be highly efficient snowmaking nozzles that use less water, less power, less air, and that has saved us quite dramatically. We've also managed the time that we use our snowmaking to be more efficient and to be more cost effective. So that is far and away the best way. And we have also gone through intensive energy audits in every single building that we own and operate.
Thank you, Adam. Mac.
I've been involved in energy efficiency and renewable energy for most of my career. In the 80s, I did 4 hydroelectric developments, developed a megawatt of power in 4 different plants around the state. Recently, the project that we're working on right now over in Heinsberg is a smart growth development, which is designed to cut down on sprawl, cut down on sprawling infrastructure, cut down on unneeded transportation, creating a pedestrian environment for people to live in. The buildings are insulated to a level of R40 in the walls, R70 in the roof, and we've put up 32 kilowatts of photovoltaic panels to power them eventually. Currently, it's powering my house and my partner's house and anything else that we can find to distribute the power to, because the houses in our development aren't inhabited yet.
Thank you. Let's go to Jim Layton, who I said was next.
Just a quickie back to the healthcare question. Single payer will certainly save some money and administratively streamline the payment system and so forth. But the utilization factor, the only way you're going to really attack that is to attack the culture of fee-for-service. I mean, the more procedures, the more income there is for the healthcare providers. And until you change that culture, you really can't get to the utilization, the reduction of utilization properly.
Mac, tackle that.
I can't disagree with you. I don't know how exactly we go about changing that. I mean, we need to reward doctors for keeping us healthy, not for providing procedures for us. Hopefully in an integrated system, at least we won't encourage doctors to duplicate those services, so that at least we only have them done once. By also with an integrated system, more sharing of information in a more transparent way, maybe we won't need as many services. I think that in a lot of cases, doctors provide services or tests because they need to cover themselves and make sure that they've done everything possible to kind of re-diagnose you. So those are things that I think that a integrated single-payer system will begin to address.
Deal with healthcare within the community, and they target preventative care. They follow up with patients as opposed to sitting back and waiting to be called. And we've actually had some good success there. We're still looking over data as to the the outcomes and whether people have been better treated. But I think that's going to be more difficult because we don't have a long time. We haven't operated these things over the long term. But the accountable care organizations have been around for a couple of years now, and we've been in that regard. We've been leaders. Much of the healthcare legislation you're seeing coming down from the federal government has included a structure that basically replicates the accountable care organizations.
Thank you. Laura, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
Wait for the mic, and then Dave, you're next. And then I'd like to ask if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question, rather than rounding up the usual suspects. But go ahead, you usual suspects.
I promise this will be my last question. Vermont has such a strong history in the area of human rights and civil rights. And first, I would like to thank Adam for his vote on marriage equity this year. Literally brought tears to my eyes when I looked up online to see how you'd voted. But there's so much talk nationally and even within the state about business, 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 the economy, the economy, the economy. How will each of you make sure that in Vermont we keep our eye on the ball when there are still so many important civil rights and human rights issues that we haven't yet dealt with, and also that outside organizations want to come into Vermont and erode?
Thank you, Laura. That question goes to Adam first.
First of all, thank you for mentioning marriage equality. I got more feedback on that from people than any other issue, probably all other issues combined. You know, that was a very emotional issue. Many people in the Valley felt very strongly on that. You know, but what I would say there is, I perhaps somewhat naively thought that social issues would not be a major part of the mandate in the State House, that many of these issues have been decided. And you know, the reality is, I think we continue to deal with them from time to time. And I think the important thing, I think Vermont has a history of being, call it fiscally thrifty or conservative, but I think we also have a history of being socially very tolerant. And I think that's important to maintain. So from my standpoint, I think we need to be tolerant of people who have other ideas and other lifestyles that we have, and as long as they're not disobeying the law, I think we need to allow it.
Thank you, Adam. Your thoughts, Mac?
I think Vermont can be proud to be on the leading edge of civil rights issues. We were the first state to outlaw slavery, first state to allow same-sex marriage by legislation rather than court case. I would be completely vigilant in terms of protecting civil rights wherever they were threatened. And I think that Vermont, you know, getting back to healthcare, I think it actually is a human right. And I think that we have an opportunity to be the laboratory state that we've been in the past with some of these cutting-edge issues and kind of lead the way.
Thank you, Mac. Okay, Dave Sellers. And then Jennifer, did you have your hand up?
I'm Dave Sellers from Warren. I want to go back to energy and jobs and what the state of Vermont could do. As we know, the Mad River Valley was a hotbed for a number of years, inventing so many alternative energy system. But I'm looking at the local war movement in the valley. If the state said we're going to buy local, and every car they buy is going to be an electric car. If you had an RFP that said we'll buy 400 electric cars, I mean a cop car can go, it's electric, can go faster than any gas car, 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. I mean if the state of Vermont said we can do that, and the infrastructure in Vermont for rail is phenomenal. 34 towns are already based on high quality rail. We're not doing, we have no commuter rail at all. Every other developed country has that. Can you see a way that Vermont can start taking advantage of this infrastructure and buy local, buy it from Vermonters and say, who in Vermont wants to invent a electric train or electric car? Who wants to kind of make sure we insulate all of our buildings with, in the state? Because then the state could be actually promoting jobs and providing a market for these beginning companies that need the market.
Thank you, Dave. Mac?
I think, looking into any kind of light rail or commuter rail, pushing that as much as possible is an excellent idea. It has to be modestly cost effective, but I think that any incentives that we can put in place to, as part of our weaning ourselves from fossil fuels, and I think we need to do that. I think buying local is great. Localvore itself is a good thing. I was one of the original committee members that put together the preservation of the Kingsbury Farm. I think that local agriculture, food from nearby, cutting down on transportation systems, healthy food, all good stuff. We should definitely promote that. The only part of what you're proposing that I think I'd be a little bit careful of is kind of a protectionist thing of, we'll only buy from Vermont. We are producing a lot of products here in Vermont that we want to sell to people in other states and other countries. So I wouldn't want to get into a position where people weren't buying our products because we weren't buying theirs.
Yeah, Debbie, I agree with you. I think the buy local initiative can be very powerful, particularly with food. Because it's produced locally, we have many quality farmers. In fact, I would argue we may have some of the finest farmers in the state. The local food argument, though, or the local food industry will succeed not only, however, by serving the Mad River Valley, but ultimately by serving other parts of Vermont and other states. So that is, I think, the true success of the local food industry, branding the Mad River Valley as a place to make food and a place to incubate food businesses, and then not only serving the valley, but also serving others. I also think Vermont is a great place. I mean, I would incubate local businesses. I'd be hesitant to think that we can survive on buying local for large, particularly large manufactured products.
Thank you, Adam. There's someone who hasn't, I can see your hand waving to the left of the, I can't see who it is. You'll have to identify yourself.
Tim Senoff, Warren. Okay. Basically, what are the 3 top things that you want to accomplish in office while you're there, and why?
Thank you. That question goes to Adam first.
The 3 top things, I think the first thing would be I'd like to do everything I can, and I think we should do everything we can to make sure that Vermont continues to pull itself back economically, and that everything in government we do, we first consider what the implications will be for the economic prosperity of our state. The second thing that I would like to do is help the residents of the valley by figuring out a better way, a more fair way and productive way to finance our education system that I hear about on virtually every door that I knock. And the third thing that I would like to do is to be good stewards of the environment and the quality of life in Vermont, and that means making sure that the projects that we pursue related to energy and elsewhere keep with the character and the brand of this state.
Thank you.
Top 3 priorities will be, 1, reforming the tax system by which we fund education. Number 2, working with Peter Shumlin, who will hopefully be our next governor, on pushing to institute a single-payer system healthcare system. And 3, the long-term, and I think the issue of our generation is to transition away from fossil fuel, do everything we can to move towards clean energy for a number of reasons, climate change being the primary one, foreign policy. I think that our foreign policy is predicated largely on securing energy supplies. So, and just the economy in general is distorted by our reliance on fossil fuel.
Thank you, Mac. Did you have a question, Wynn?
Thank you, Lisa. Mac and Adam, there are many things about this valley that I think are precious to me and to most people here. But 2 sectors I'd like you to comment on. And I'd like to ask your opinion about what do you think are the major issues facing these sectors, and how do you think Montpelier can help them? This is a bit of softball for you, Adam, so I apologize, Mac, but the first sector is actually agriculture and the farming community, and the second is tourism. And we've heard, some of the candidates, and I think both Peter Shumlin and Brian Doobie has spoken about the importance of tourism and the positive impact it's had on the economy in the downturn. So I'd like to know what your opinion is in terms of helping both of those industries move forward in this difficult climate.
Thank you, Wynn. So Mac, that's your turn. That's your question first.
I think both of those industries are incredibly important to the valley in particular. Agriculture, as I just mentioned, I've worked on preservation of Kingsbury Farm. I think we can do more of that kind of thing. I think we need to help our farmers. I think we need to make sure that the current use program is maintained and that it's strong. I think that farmers, actually farming and tourism are related in that half of the reason that people come here from other states is to see our farms as part of the scenery. So, yes, I think we need to preserve agricultural land, and I think the only way to really do that in the long run is to make them productive and operating farms. In terms of tourism in general, it is the most important, it's the most significant industry in the valley. I would certainly be vigilant to make sure that the needs of the tourist industry in this valley were taken care of.
Thank you. Your thoughts, Adam?
You know, starting with agriculture, there was a very innovative program that came out that actually was created by a colleague from New Haven, Christopher Bray, called the Farm to Plate program, which essentially helped get food from the farm to the plate, and specifically in schools, but also in other places around Vermont. I think that idea of helping promote local farmers and bringing it to public institutions like the State House, like the various schools and the like, was highly successful. The second thing I would say in terms of agriculture, you know, is somewhat related to tourism, in that Vermont has a brand. It's an unusual brand. And it may be unreasonable to think that people will be seeking Vermont milk down in Massachusetts. I don't think it's at all unreasonable to think that Vermont products can be branded. Maple syrup is a classic example of that. In terms of, sorry, did that sign go up? Okay.
Okay. Hold that thought.
I didn't get a chance to answer on the tourism, but you know, really quickly, I would say first, by all means, continue to fund tourism. I mean, every session, it's a football going back and forth about whether we should fund tourism, whether we shouldn't fund tourism. For every dollar we spend in tourism, we get $7 back. 2, we need a consistent energy policy that guarantees energy at a cost that we can all deal with, because that's a very high cost for us. And 3, let's make sure our tax policies and payroll tax policies are encouraging the businesses to operate.
Thank you. I saw a hand up there that I can't actually see, so you just have to say your name, and then we'll come back to you, Randy.
Sam from Warren.
Do you have a last name, Sam?
Greshin.
Okay. Nepotism. That's all right, you're allowed. Kudos to you for coming.
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that we do have a climate change issue and fossil fuels issue that we need to slowly wean our way off of that. And I think it's also becoming increasingly obvious that my generation is going to take the fall for this and be a big contributor to try to solve this. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but do you guys have any plans to start on this issue?
Thank you, Sam. And that, of course, goes to you first.
Was that plans for energy?
Climate change.
Oh, climate change. Yes. Thank you to the very handsome and articulate person who answered that question. You know, I think our climate change plans are, you know, entail our energy policy substantially. I mean, I think if you look at climate change, what leads to climate change, it's fossil fuel usage. And I think our energy policy that would wean us of fossil fuel usage and provide more and cheaper and alternative sources of electric power would be the answer to that. And, you know, we passed 2 years ago, or last year, a feed-in tariff bill that provided incentives to energy developers to create alternative forms of energy that will help power us in the future. And, you know, that was called H446. Not only did I support that, but I promoted that on the House floor. We also have a Clean Energy Development Fund that was created in 2005 to help finance energy projects, specifically electric, but they can also be wind or methane or the like. So we also, you know, have to recognize that we can provide the incentives, but we need to provide the climate and the business climate for entrepreneurs to take the risks and create the projects for us.
Thank you. Your thoughts, Mac?
You're absolutely right. It's your generation and generations to come that will pay for our delay in tackling this problem. I think that and so I completely agree. As I said before, it's the issue of our generation. It's the most important thing for us to tackle. Easy to lose track of that in our year-to-year budget crises, which need to be dealt with, but next year's budget crisis will be long forgotten, 20 years from now or 50 years from now when we're still dealing with climate change. I think that we need to get beyond trying to secure energy at the cheapest price possible. It's not going to be free to make the transition. I think that we should, both at the federal and the state level, think about tax policies that encourage that transition and ease the transition for those people and industries that are going to be inconvenienced by the transition.
Thank you. Did I see a question over here? Skosh?
Tom back here had one, and I'm here. How about you?
Okay, so we'll go Tom, then I'm going to go Randy and Skosh, and then that's 40 questions these guys have been peppered with. You guys are...
Tom Bisbee from up in Facein. And first of all, I think we are very lucky to have both of you. I think you're very, very impressive young people. And I gather you have to ask a question of each of you. It has to be a common question. So therefore, I will ask Mac why he's a Democrat, and then let's get to the chase and ask Adam why he's an independent.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so Mac.
I am a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. I believe in the platform I agree with the platform that the Democratic Party has put forward for the state. I think that Democrats in general are very concerned with civil rights, with the needs of the less fortunate among us that need to be protected. I think that Democrats are in favor of taking care of this climate change issue that we were just talking about. I think the only thing that I disagree with the Vermont Democratic Party on is Act 60.
Thank you, Mac. Adam?
Thank you, Tom. I'm an independent, and I've always been an independent. And I tend to vote for the best idea and the best person. And no party has a monopoly on good ideas. And I think when people elect you, they elect you to represent them. And you should be representing them, and you shouldn't be representing a party. And there's not any party that can best represent the interests of the Valley. And so I'm an independent because I think I should be in the State House representing the best interests of the people right here. And I couldn't find any party to match that.
Thank you, Adam. And Randy, you had another question?
Yes, everybody's always giving the state a hard time about being bad business climate. And the only issue they seem to concentrate on is taxes. I just read a magazine piece rating the various states in other categories. Vermont was, I think, second in high school graduation. It was very high up in graduate degrees, postgraduate degrees, quality of life issues. If you want a really cheap state to do business in, you go to Alabama. They're last in education. So I was wondering if you guys can take these other factors into consideration when you're thinking about the balance between education and taxes.
Thank you, Randy. Adam?
I think most of the people in this room live here because we think it's a good place to live. And I think we voted with our feet and our families and our livelihood. So I think it's probably easy to criticize every state in one area or another. And I think Vermont gets a bad rap in terms of a business climate because it's been somewhat haphazard on the promotion of tourism, on the promotion of business. I think, you can measure taxes any way you want and probably come out with any number you want. But I think it's clear that we're not at the bottom of the tax states. And I think it's somewhat clear that we're towards the middle or the upper. And I think we need to recognize that. But some people believe that that's not the most important thing. And they believe that education is important. I certainly do. I wouldn't have moved here without a good education system. And they believe that the quality of life is important. And maybe it costs a bit more to support that quality of life. But I think most of the people are in this room because they believe it's worth it.
Thank you, Adam.
I agree with you, Randy. I think that, as I said before, we tend to give Vermont a bad rap. We broadcast the fact that Vermont is bad for business. I don't think that's true across the board, certainly. I think it's a great place to do business. And I agree with you. I think we should emphasize those and talk about those things that are good about the state. I certainly believe in education. I've spent many years on the school board. That's how I got into this amazing political career, is through working with the school. I think we need to maintain the quality of education. I think we've got a great quality of education here. That's not to say that we can't and shouldn't look at ways to deliver that more efficiently if we can, but I think that it does need to remain a local issue and something that we control at the town level so that we can maintain that quality of education that we all like.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Scotia?
Yes, John Norton Warren. I think that I heard today that virtually every Republican running for office in this election cycle is running against climate change. And that one of the consequences of that, Vermont is a participant in the RGGI program, which is a regional cap and trade for all practical purposes, which generates something on the order of $700 million which is reinvested in the various participants for renewable energy development. And I understand there are several states, and I don't know if Vermont is one of them, where participation in RGGI is going to come up as a matter for the legislature to vote on, to withdraw from it. And I guess the point of this is, one, first, would either of you, how would the two of you respond to something that came up into the legislature along those lines? Because all these things come to you first. They don't go to Peter Shulman or Brian Doobie. They go to the legislature. And the other one is a broader question, which is, in order to promote things, in order to promote the resolution of the problem that your son addressed, Adam, it's going to cost some money, and that money's going to come from other places. It might burden the tax system. It might, withdraw some resources from other areas. How do you see that trade-off in something like RGGI, where this costs us some money, but it's reinvested? How do you see those kinds of trade-offs as they come before you in the legislature?
Thank you. Mac, that question goes to you first.
I would definitely vote to stay in a program like that. I think so. That's the short answer to that one. In terms of the cost, it is going to cost us money to transition to a fossil fuel free economy. And to a certain extent, that's not bad. I think that ultimately the only way that we're going to make this transition is if we let the market work. So I think that sometimes we are tripping all over ourselves to figure out a way to make the transition without it costing anybody anything. I think that we have to make the cost of energy, we have to reflect the true cost of our energy decisions. Fossil fuel's cheap because we're deferring a problem. We have to start putting the true price to the use of fossil fuel so that the alternatives become more attractive.
Thank you, Mac. And Adam?
To your first point, Scotia, I think with climate change, either you believe it or you don't. I'm not a scientist, but I believe that climate change is important, and I think we need to address it. And I think if we don't, we're going to suffer the consequences, or actually my son will suffer the consequences. Reggie, that you referred to, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, yes, it's a cap-and-trade system, and I think it's important that we stay involved with it. I don't know the specifics on a federal level, but I do think it is important to stay involved with it. And I think, you know, it's clear that to make any transition, we're going to have to bear some costs. I personally believe that we need to be mindful of those costs, and we need to accept the fact that those costs are going to have to be partitioned out. And we also need to be mindful that many people live here and moved here based on a system that required transportation, that required power, and that required energy. And they may or may not have the economic means to make a very quick change. So we need to be mindful of the costs and the pace at which we get there. But I don't think I would disagree at all. In fact, I would agree that we need to try to target and aim in that direction.
Thank you, Adam. And thank all of you guys. That was an amazing round of questions. We're going to move into candidate closing statements now. But the good news is both Adam and Mac have agreed to hang out in the lobby and answer questions even longer. And the bar is open, so you can wet your whistles and ask them any question you may have. So we're moving into closing statements, and we're starting with Adam.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. It's really nice to see a good crowd out here. But you know, there are a lot of good ideas in the State House. In fact, I've been impressed how many good ideas there are. But politics is a combination of good ideas and advocacy. Because a good idea without advocacy is a good idea that means nothing. So, you know, I think you need someone who can advocate for you. And I think as a freshman in the legislature, I was a good advocate. And I think being an independent not only did not hurt me, I think it actually helped me. Because people came to me with ideas, and they came to me with suggestions. They didn't know which way I was going to go. And I think that was very important. And advocacy and ideas got me onto the committees that I was on, and got me to the Ways and Means Committee, which was a very important place to be when it comes to property tax policy. So I don't need to be on a Democratic Party or a Republican Party. I need to be in the Mad River Valley Party.
Thank you, Adam. And Mac?
I also want to thank you all for coming. It's been great. The whole campaign has been great. I've been going door to door. I will, in the next 2 weeks, manage to hit every door in the valley. At least I think I will, and if I've missed anybody, please give me a call, and I'll come back and talk to you.
You can come to my door.
Well, I haven't finished yet, but you haven't come to my door either. I haven't finished them all, so don't despair. But I would disagree with Adam. I think that independent voters are great because they vote for the best person and the best idea at the time. But I think that when you get to the legislature, you want to be working in concert with one of the parties or the other. I don't see the advantage to the Mad River Valley to not being in the part of that decision-making process. So, you know, I pledge if I am elected, I'll bring my expertise in housing, planning, energy, conservation, renewable energy, my experience in education and municipal affairs, but mostly my clear convictions and good judgment, which I think is the most important thing for a legislator. Thanks.
Thank you to both of the candidates, and thanks again to a great audience.